Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and for yet another return, because we had to have him on season 6, I got Jason Perez of Shelf Stories. How you doing, Jason?
If you're watching the Zoom call, I'm holding up the 6, everybody. 6 seasons of Jason and Beyond Solitaire. Yo, my peoples, what's up? What's up, Liz?
Not too much. It's been too long since we hung out, since I haven't seen you since PAX.
PAX, which was like, as we record this 3 months ago, and it's too long, man. We gotta record game reviews. Let's do some game reviews. Like this, all this like hoity-toity intellectual stuff is fine, but like let's have fun.
You know me and my navel-gazing tendencies.
Yeah, right.
So we did get together for a very nerdy task, which is that Jason and I both read a recently released book called Playing Oppression. And this is by Mary Flanagan of Dartmouth. And how do I say his name appropriately?
We're going to go with Mikael Jacobsson. That's fine.
Yes, we're American and we're just going to ruin everything. Sure. But he's at MIT.
I am showing it here. There we go. Mikael Jacobsson. I'm showing it on the camera right now. Both theorists of board games. This is not their first work. I think this is their first work together, but they definitely highly decorated, published people. Mary has at least been on your show.
Yes.
I don't know if the other one has.
No, so these are these are board game academics who have written a book called Playing Oppression, and it's about a lot of themes that if you have been in the hobby long enough and enjoying conversations about colonialism in games long enough, you've actually touched on a lot of the things in this book. So we're going to talk about it and kind of talk about what new things it brings to the table, whether help you decide whether you want to read it, kind of pull out what was interesting in it.
This is a review, people. We are going to get into the guts of this thing. We both read it. We both, kind of processed it. And we're going to give our honest thoughts. Full disclosure, it's a small circle, and I just did a chat with Mary Flanagan. We did a Colonialism and Board Games chat kind of based on her book. And she's coming back on the show in a couple of months to do something else. So it's like we have these relationships. So disclosure, we have these relationships, but we're going to do the best we can to provide an honest perspective.
Yes. And that said, I do want to say I'm very happy to see academics interacting with hobby board gamers more. Yeah. That is something that I personally believe should have happened much earlier. And I'm very glad that it's happening now because, I'm post-doc, right? So I've lived my life like with academic training, but not in academia at this point. And I see some of the most lively discussions on these topics happening on Twitter.
Yeah. In
a forum somewhere, on somebody's blog. Like, and so, it makes me really happy to see like my worlds collide because I think they should actually. I think we've got things to say to each other that matter.
Right. And so this book is a contribution to that discourse. And we're going to assess what the contribution makes. As I was saying to Liz before, I think of this book in 3 different levels. On the one hand, they are tracing, so the subtitle is The Legacy of Conquest and Empire in Colonialist Board Games. Focus on the idea of legacy. Like this goes back. So they go back to the beginning of board games. They talk about the earliest board games like set and chess, and they go through games that were made in the medieval period and the Renaissance period. Like it's not like comprehensive. It's not like a huge tome, but they give you a paragraph or 2 and they give lovely pictures of the Mansion of Happiness and Snakes and Ladders, or the original iterations of it. So there's a level at which this is like a history of board games from whatever colonialist perspective it is. So they're picking. It's not every board game, but it is. There's that level at which you're going to enjoy this book, and then they are going, because they're scholars. They bring in some scholarship, and we'll talk about that after that. And then the final level is, they say at the very first chapter that they don't just want this to be an academic tome, that they want to achieve some kind of change. They want to forward the conversation. They want to chart ways in which we can get new games and kind of deconstruct some of the colonialist paradigm. So 1, 2, 3, we're going to try to do the best we can to kind of hit all those points. So let's start. History, your history buff, Liz. Did you have a little bit of fun kind of seeing the historical trace that this book engages with?
Yeah, so this book is basically split into 2 halves. For those of you who haven't read it, there's kind of like the history background half, and then the let's talk about modern board games in this context half. So there's a lot of historical contextualization here, and I thought it was pretty good. It really hits on some of the kind of important aspects of how colonialism has infected gaming from early days. So, for example, Snakes and Ladders originally had some quite spiritual elements, but it got sort of reprocessed by British commercial interests. And
Well, it was an
then
Indian game. It was
yes,
based
it's
on
an Indian
it's
game.
based on a Indian subcontinent game.
It is.
So you not the American Indians, Amerindians, but like actual Europe, Indian subcontinent. And it had there was a conscious sense that like they were educating, like these were educational tools, and so the original sense was like, okay, we are going to educate in Hindu virtues, and and it's going to have that kind of tilt to it. And then British come in, they appropriate, they do the things that we've talked about many times,
Yes.
and they reproduced the game, which eventually we have come to call Snakes and Ladders, and it was kind of recast, which cultures do, to a more Christian virtue centered lens. So like you
Yes.
go up, the snakes represent vices, and so the ladders are represent kind of your ladder up in virtue away from the snakes.
Right. Or you end up with something that's kind of not having much of a value set at all. It gets presented as purely for entertainment and then sold back to people in India. So it's like, oh, let's just sell back these people's own game, but like stripped of its cultural meaning. Great.
Right.
Commerce.
Yeah.
So overall, I thought the analysis of British colonial gaming and mechanisms was really interesting. However, there was also one big omission that I want to bring in.
Ooh.
So
we're already starting.
Well, okay, it's actually a person who got it omitted. So if you search for British colonialism board games in like Google Books or anything, the very first hit is Megan Norch's Gaming Empire. And I actually had her on episode 35 of this podcast. And so I looked for her in the bibliography and she was not there.
Ooh.
And so if you want to get a really interesting read on games, puzzles, etc., and its impact on British children, that's actually, I think, the best place to go. So Megan Norch's Gaming Empire, I'll link it in the show notes.
Sure.
But this book covers a lot of the same ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really enjoyed the discussion of not only, looking how, colonial empires like co-opt people's culture and then sell it back in kind of deteriorated ways, but also
but that's a little strong, right? I mean, like reinculturated ways, like reflecting the cultural values of European culture, capitalist culture, all that kind of thing.
Yes, although I'm a historian, so I'd be like, no, give me the original.
No, fair enough.
But the other thing that I thought was really good is they had a good discussion of how British games meant for British children. And this is, again, I would actually think that Norch's work is a fantastic place to go on this. But it talks about how the mechanisms and the themes basically teach British children to become little imperialists. So things like travel narratives and depicting people in other countries as just sort of like these amusing things that you can go see as part of the grand tour of the world from your British perspective. Those sorts of things popping in from an early age do impact the way that you see the world and how you see the world as existing for you. Mm-hmm. And so it was just a really fascinating way of kind of putting together a lot of what I think that we like to say about historical tourism in games now. It kind of harkens back to discussions that you and I have had about modern games. But it really brought home the point that I think that you and I are always trying to make, which is that there's no such thing as just a game. Like all games are cultural artifacts. All games say something about how we see the world, what we think is normal, what kinds of mechanisms we naturally would be inclined to use to interact with the world around us. And so this book makes a really nice case for how British colonial era games actually brought children into that same culture and made it normal to just kind of plunder other countries and just use them for trade and see people in other places as exotic. And, that starts in the drawing room at home when you're 7.
Right. So that gets us to the second part. So first of all, history of games, it's fun. You'll see game boards, you'll see, the evolution. It's not just Britain. They talk about French games, and there was one instance of like, Mexican games and that kind of thing. And so we'll get to that in a second. So fun history, kind of survey of where we've been and where we are now. Now we're getting into the kind of central scholarly thesis of the game, of this book. So as Liz said, this game utterly rejects the notion of it's just a game, right? And that's kind of part of the deal, right? That's part of the cultural conversation. Like, you've been in these conversations, Liz. What do you say? What comment comes out? It's just a game. We're thinking too much of it. You're putting it in there, right? Yes. You're putting it in there, and like and we're doing our own thing, and we're putting it in there. So we don't want to rehash that conversation. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like that's a food fight. You know, you either kind of believe it or you don't. And we're trying to make the best case that we can. This book kind of helps with that. That's one of the real virtues of this, that games aren't just games, that games reflect culture and games recreate culture.
Yes,
So
that is a beautiful way to put that.
So in a sense, the game is any piece of media, not just games, any piece of media, right? A movie, a book. A game talked about one quote, there was like a novel. It's like the novel's only possible within like, you know, bourgeois European society. It's like, okay, I think about that, but like kind of situating these hinge points of culture and saying, okay, this piece of culture came from has all these cultural things within it, and it recreates. So like in a game sense, you're doing the thing, you're being the colonizer, you're being the king, you're being the this, that, and the third thing, and you kind of add to the larger culture and there's an educational piece to it. And so I think this is where the book makes the strongest case, is that it does a lot over the course of the chapters to show how game makers in the past have taken on an explicitly educational role in games.
Yes.
And so the whole thing of, you know, British Colonial Games taught kids how to be good little imperialists. And so I don't know if that was fleshed out. That's kind of the thing that with the Megan Norcher point, but that's not totally resonant with what's happening here. There was another part we're talking about in terms of France and like the people in the French Revolution. One of the things they did in order to kind of make France didn't exist as a polity, a democracy, like that had to be created. You don't just overthrow a king and all of a sudden we got a new country. Everybody
buy in. Easy. That's worked every time.
But that's how they make it seem in like the history books, right? So it's like, 1789, French Revolution. Now it's a new country. Heck no! Like this has to be done and practiced and instantiated and taught. And games were one way in which France was made. The idea of France, the idea of Mexico, like they talked about a little bit about how games proliferated in that particular case when Mexico was engaged in revolutions. Those games made that country, and it was done purposefully. The game makers knew what they were doing, and it's like, here you go. And they didn't say be a good colonizer. That's not like that on the top of the box. Here's how I teach colonization. It gives it a kind of nice veneer, and it just so happens that that's what you're doing. That kind of thing.
I think one thing that this book really brings to the surface in a way that I think is always worth talking about, especially for all of us as players, right, is that creating a culture makes it's work.
Right.
It's work. Whether you realize you're doing that work or not, I think is debatable. But I mean, even if you go to a game convention and you play 5 different games, right, there's certain expectations for how you're going to engage with that game, for how you're going to be taught that game, for the sorts of things you might see in that game. All of that is culture creation at work.
Yes.
And so, what other messages are coming with it? I don't know. That's why you have to try to take a step back from yourself and see it. And it's so much easier to see. Like, I love talking about games in history because when you have that distance, it's so much easier to see what's happening. Like, we can't see ourselves clearly, but we can look back at another period in time and see some of the same issues that we have playing out with a little bit more distance. Right. And, we're never going to know the full, truth of any historical period, right? But giving us the distance makes it so much easier to kind of look at what we have now and think through what did I see in this other period that I don't necessarily see in myself but might be there.
So speaking to the It's Just a Game crowd, because that's kind of the shot against the bow, right? Like in terms of whatever changes is making, it's like trying to educate people, a way to criticize that paradigm and try to adopt this more kind of holistic paradigm. I pose it that it is on the It's Just a Game perspective to answer the question, where does culture come from? Okay, it doesn't come from games. It doesn't come from movies. You're not influenced by it. People make their own decisions. Well, where does it come from? And so you have to answer that question. So it's like, we're answering the question. We're like, okay, why do we, have these games? Why do we constantly get these colonialist games? Why do we constantly get or games that, exoticize, right? The outsides. We could talk about where do these things come from? And so we're answering it. You may not buy it. It's like, okay, fine. But then let's hear your perspective on, okay, where do these ideas come from? Does it descend from the sky? Was these, I think there's an idea that okay, culture is kind of always this way. European culture always has done this, and it's kind of like a time memorial thing, which 5 minutes of reflection, or maybe not 5 minutes, that's being dismissive, but just a considered reflection of that thesis kind of, I think, falls apart because
Yes.
things don't come from anywhere. Like, we do it, humans do it, and not just like powerful people or certain artists or whatever it is, like great men. We all do it. And we
Yes.
all do it. Either we're making the games, or we're playing the games, or we're doing what you and I are doing, a broadcasting about the games. So we're all involved in this culture process, and games just so happen to be one from among many, many different fields. So
Yes.
just the idea that, like, I think maybe a culture person, kind of imagining that back and forth, they might say, well, it's a game, right? Other things do it, movies and books, and but games are just games. And we're trying to say,
Yeah. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, games are art, games are media. And just as you can have kind of like a trashy, no, my air quotes, like grocery store checkout aisle book, and you can also have like Proust or something, I feel like gaming is the same. Like, you have the games that are ostensibly just for fun, but do communicate things about our culture, whether we realize it or not. And then you have things that are kind of heavy, meditated statements about culture, but they're both culture, and they're both creating gaming culture.
right.
And, we're all part of this process. And so accepting your role means that you can do something about it, as opposed to just kind of thoughtlessly flow along with it.
Mm-hmm. So, okay. So the book is trying to make this point. It is trying to do so doing in the scholarly way. It is like Liz is smiling if you're not seeing the Zoom call. It is quoting the very familiar theorist, if you've been to grad school in the last however many years in any liberal arts program. So I haven't been in a little while. It's been, I think I graduated with my undergrad degree in 2001. And I haven't been steeped in like the latest cultural theory since then. So, but I remember Frantz Fanon and Edward Said, and there's a couple other names that I recall. But things have developed, and Liz, you had noticed some of the other names that have popped up.
Yes. So this book makes a lot of references to, and it's been a while, I've been out of grad school for 10 years now, but I still recognize the names. I was proud of myself. It stuck. But, there is an entire branch of theoretical work that focuses on what's called postcolonialism. And so postcolonialism is basically the study of how former colonies respond to the impacts socially, intellectually, materially of having been colonized. And one phrase that comes up a few times in this book, or a term, is the subaltern. So the subaltern is basically,
I didn't even know what that is. Yeah.
So basically it describes like lower social classes and social groups that have been displaced to the margins by an invasive colonial power. So in an imperial situation, somebody who's subaltern would be a native person who has had their agency reduced, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure.
And so,
natives and reservations and displaced, yes. You were elite in the old South, but now you're kind of lower class in the new place. Yeah.
Yes. And so there's like a, oh God, what's the article? It's called something like Can the Subaltern Speak? And basically there's a whole bunch of kind of philosophy, I would call theory modern philosophy, right, happening about these topics and oppressed peoples, and like asking, to what extent has their actual voice and ability to assess themselves and their culture been elided by the fact that they have been colonized? And so when you talk about post-colonial stuff, you're talking about, can the subaltern regain agency? How do they now view themselves? How do we break away from that sort of colonial period and do our own thing? There's like a whole lot of, it basically studies the continued dominance of the West and the West way of defining things, knowledge, culture, but in a world where we might like to kind of walk back from that.
Do you feel, in your opinion, because I mean, this is a review, we're speaking to different audiences. We have audiences that are well read, they have 17 grad degrees, and they'll eat this stuff up. We also have gamers that just want a game, and a lot of gaming is college educated, but they're not necessarily educated in post-colonial theory or whatever. Did you feel this book was accessible to both audiences? Do you feel it was pitched to either one of those audiences, or something else is going on? What do you think?
Ooh, okay, this is interesting because I feel like this book kind of hit it was almost like an awkward middle, if that makes sense. Like it kind of depends on what knowledge base you're coming in with. If you were an academic and you know nothing about board games, I think that this book would do a lot for you because it would give you a sense of the modern landscape, but in academic terms that help you understand, okay, maybe this is important. I should take it seriously. So I would say that that is the most potent possible audience for this book. People who understand the theoretical underpinnings, who understand the little linguistic and argumentative tracks that this book takes, because it felt like going back 10 years when I read this book. Like I was just
would
like,
have wrote this term paper.
I understand exactly how this argument is going to proceed. I understand exactly how they're going to make it. Like it almost felt like doing a dance where I actually already knew the steps and I didn't realize that I did until I started dancing.
Well, you're in a different hall now, like you're doing it in a different hall, which is the gaming hall.
Yeah, it was very weird. Not in a bad way, just really trippy, because it was like my worlds were colliding in a funky way. But I think that if you're an academic and you want to understand how we could talk about gaming in an academic way, this book is rock solid. I think if you are someone who has no idea about the academic side of things, I don't think that should stop you from reading it. I think that you'll get enough out of it, but you should be aware that there are going to be times when you're like, what are they talking about?
Yeah, Subaltern. How do you, I totally missed that.
Yeah. And so like that can be a little bit awkward. But I don't think that that should stop you, because frankly, the way that I made it in academia is just by continually reading things I didn't fully understand until I'd seen it enough times that I had context for it. You got to start somewhere. And so I actually think Playing Oppression is a relatively decent place to start. Just make sure that you're looking at so the other trick, right, to reading academic books is that you make notes of names you don't know, you look at the bibliography, and you decide if you actually care enough to track it down. So, because one in academia, because the inter-references, the intertextual nature of it is that you can't just read one book and like feel totally grounded. You have to read around, and then as things start going in circles, you realize you've created like an intellectual net where you can catch everything. So I would actually say that go for it. It's not going to hurt you. And the other thing that was weird is that I kind of felt like, for me, as somebody who's kind of been in both sides, like thinking about board games at a fairly high critical level and having been in academia, the book felt so familiar that it was almost more of a repackaging of things that have already happened for an academic audience than a totally new venture, is how I would say. So like, I would say that somebody like Dan Thoreau would probably read this and be like, yeah. Or like somebody like Cole Worley probably read this and was like, oh yeah, okay.
But they would say something like, thank you for saying it in a shorter way that's under 200 pages kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. This is short. It's a good intro to the situation. So like, I wouldn't read this expecting like a complete, everything's flipped on its head and my life is forever changed. But I would read this and look for, okay, this is a really good overview of like the situation as it stands now, both in terms of historically why this is important, and also in terms of games mentioned, like what are some of the little landmarks in our modern gaming culture that you need to hit and know about. So this brought up Puerto Rico. This brought up Archipelago. A bunch of like the sort of classic little, modern hobby games that people have expressed discomfort about over the years. But they're all kind of brought into one place as examples in this book. So if you want like the full overview, instead of having to read 5 million different board game geek conversations and arguments on Reddit and tweets, this is where you go.
Right. Okay. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Like this game is, or this book. I keep on saying this game because we're so used to reviewing games. Now we're reviewing a book. That's what we do. So this book is, I think it's coming from an academic tradition and in some way speaking to an academic tradition, and kind of like inviting people along into an academic conversation, doing things to kind of make it more accessible. So it's not like a weighty academic tone at all. I commend it for being, quite readable. And I think, people who don't have that academic background will get something out of it. They won't get everything, but they'll get something. I think one of the weaknesses of the book, and this is kind of getting into that kind of last level of, okay, this book is academic and in a way it kind of preaches to the choir a little bit. In order to get change, you have to kind of branch out and speak to different audiences and kind of convince them. And so one thing where I wish the book could have done a little bit more was hunt bigger fish. So it has a point to make about colonization in particular, and it has a way it thinks about colonization in particular. I'll get to that in a second. Actually, I'll get to it right now because we're talking about it. So the key chapter for me the key passage for me was on page 13, where they define colonialism. So what is this thing that we're talking about, this colonialist thing? And they are looking at it from like a very kind of observable empire perspective. Like, okay, that as soon as they say, what are we doing? What is this, the colonialism thing? Well, the Persians did it, and the Romans did it, and on and on, and the Europeans did it, and the Americans in some way are still doing it because we have Puerto Rico and Guam, that kind of stuff. It is the active act of one country going to another place and taking their stuff and being the boss of whatever land it is from an absentee perspective. That involves violence, that involves suppression, but like for the most part, that is what colonialism is, according to what this book says. And it is taking a very much lefty perspective, because it doesn't talk too much about like the great things that have been accomplished. We built roads, and we brought medicines and all kind of stuff. It is talking about, quote, the irrevocable violence to families, individuals, livelihoods, spiritual system, community bonds, environmental damage, destruction of habitats. It's not a happy view of colonialism. No. Or at least in terms of like the overt act of colonialism. So what this book did was focus on those games that explicitly take on colonialism. So like, you mentioned Archipelago. It talks about Navigador. It talks about, some of these other games. And it's like, okay, within that like bubble, yeah, sure, let's do it. But should we care about that bubble? It's, if you're making the case that like games have this larger influence, then you kind of have to talk about the games that have influence. Like, what is everybody playing? There was a couple of pages on Catan that could have been bigger, because Catan is a hugely influential aspect. And it quoted an article by my good friend Greg Long Albright, who wrote about Catan, quoted it, but kind of like moved on. It's like, no, we have to be here. And I mentioned this when I was chatting with Mary. Take It to Ride has dimensions of, because it evokes like the real world Old West. And the real world Old West is very much a field of colonialism, and they're not directly dealing with it, but there's kind of stuff under the surface that, if you are aware of the history of the Old West, kind of tease that out. Why do I mention Ticket to Ride? Because it's one of the biggest games out there. And so many games in terms of influence, those are the games that are teaching other games how to be and what's popular and what's fun and that kind of thing. So it wasn't bad. Like, they talked about, certain games. They mentioned the point, like, okay, some games that are Spirit of Shar, they're influential, that kind of thing. But I feel like because of the way they define colonialism in that very, empire taking over other empire and like the overt acts of violence, it talked about certain things and kind of didn't miss some other dimensions, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And okay, so I actually have a couple things to say about this. The other one thing I also thought was interesting, right, is they tried to bring up a couple of games that are about colonial themes, but are pushing against the grain of how those things are presented. Sure. And I actually thought they did both of those games kind of dirty. So like, I thought that Pax Pamir was like unfairly dismissed very quickly in just a paragraph in this book, because it was like, oh, well, it still uses colonial structures to, talk about, to as a gaming mechanism. And so like, whatever is basically how I felt about that. And I was like, wait a minute, like Pax Pamir is an extremely well thought out and intelligent statement about colonialism. It's really an academic work of its own, and just having it, just kind of watching it get tossed like that was like, ouch. And then I also thought that there are certainly legitimate criticisms to how the Dahan come through in Spirit Island, but again, it was like, it just felt like a little tap, dismiss, move on. And I don't know, I wanted a little more. But I actually think that this is where, and I mentioned that academics, and hobby gamers should talk more, is what I actually would have liked to see is kind of an expansion on what you've been saying about things like historical tourism, because the entire British history segment of this book was kind of an argument for the legitimacy of claims that you've made about that and that we've talked about in the past. Where, you are subconsciously being taught certain things about how you fit into the world through the games that you play. And so I thought it was very interesting that the modern games they chose to talk about were more explicitly colonial, when I think that you actually could have gone in a different or a further direction by trying to apply the sort of subconscious aspects of what's happening for kids in the games of the past. And looking at what kind of parallels we have for that now. And that's where I think something like Ticket to Ride is important, right? Because it's not just Ticket to Ride is really popular. That's not the sole reason why you'd consider it. It's that Ticket to Ride elides really key parts of history in order to be pleasant.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah, and they mentioned the author of the Mikael. I apologize if I pronounce your name. We haven't met in person. They mentioned about there was a Finnish version of Ticket to Ride, like the most popular game. I think it was called the African Star.
Yes.
And that one was pretty obvious, because it's the African Star. They're taking the gem and they're leaving Africa with it. So it's kind of an obvious thing. It's like, okay, that allowed them to talk about it, and I was like, yes, that this is the most popular game in Finland. Let's talk about it. Right, because we're not talking necessarily about like the topic. We're talking about influence. This is a game about influence, and so they did it. It's there to be teased about. But if we're talking like, how does this? Why should people care about this? I think teasing out the idea that games are influenced by influence culture, that should have been kind of the active verb to me of the book. Again, it almost gets there. It's not like it doesn't. But there are points where I think it could have made the point a little bit stronger.
Yeah, I think our quote issues, it's not like, oh, I have such an issue with this book. It's, like you chose an emphasis that I personally wouldn't have chosen from my perspective. And like, I mean, it's they're the authors of the book.
So I hammer this because of what they said in terms of what the goal of this book is. They want to make things better. They don't just want to present if the goal was humble, like I want to, like I want to do an academic work. I wouldn't say it. I wouldn't bang on about this. But if the goal is to, really, move the ball forward, get the publishers notice, because that's who eventually is going to make the change. Is like the publishers deciding, would a publisher pick this up? Would a group of gamers, a group of influential gamers, would an influencer who has a huge following, would they pick this up and like, oh wow, we got to change our minds? I'm a little iffy on that. So going back to the idea of the way to define colonialism. So in terms of like focusing on the overt acts and the actual, like going over and colonizing, planting your flag, and genociding the natives, you have a large segment of the gaming populace that is willing to kind of in their minds make that trade-off. They say, oh yeah, they were bad. The colonialists were bad and the Nazis were bad and these people were bad, but we're good now. So reminding me that they were bad doesn't do anything for me. All you're trying to do is make me feel guilty. And so like I read that section, that particular section, because like this is where we're defining what we're talking about in the book. And it's like, okay, this will happen in the past, it's happening now, and these people were bad. It's written in a way that lets people off the hook. And that lets them say, okay, these are the bad people. I'm not the bad person, so that just doesn't apply to me. And so I did something.
No, I can see I see your point. I think it's a good point. Yeah.
And so like still, and believe me, I and this is born out of like years of cultural criticism at this point. Like Liz and I have been in this game for a little while now with multiple videos, and hearing that pushback of like, it's so like you can make all those points and it's a huge structure, but it's so easily dismissible if it's just at the level of like, okay, these people did bad things. Okay. So how do you fix that? You fix that by really widening the scope and bringing in the full sense of what colonialism is and how it impacts. It is not just a bunch of powerful people did a bunch of bad things. It is an entire cultural system. It is a system of education. It is a system of, it's basically like a story generator. Like, I mean, the colonists did what they did because they thought they were good.
Yeah.
I'm the hero. And this book plays with that, but it doesn't, to me, it doesn't really hit that point home. Like, okay, no, we're doing a good thing. We're bringing the civilizations to the natives and all that kind of thing. So when you're in a game, it's not that you're playing a colonialist. You're encouraged to think that I'm the hero. The colonialist is the hero. I kind of wanted more analysis of like that aspect of games as like, I am the hero now. And teaching that the colonialist, the Nazi, or whoever you're talking about, the warlord, the magnate, the robber baron, is the hero, and how much that has a wide cultural thing. And when I think as a person, as an everyday person, that these people are the heroes, then that influences the larger culture. I'm piecing this together, so I hope that
I like the way you're piecing it together. It makes a lot of sense. And the other thing it kind of made me think of that I had meant to mention, like I didn't take notes, but this was like a mental note that I'd had, is so the other thing I noticed that was very interesting about this particular book, like as an academic work, is, so, you know, my PhD is in ancient Christianity. And so I read a lot of things just that, you know, people argue about, okay, so is it okay to call a heretic just because ancient Orthodox Christians did? And how do we change our identities? And, you know, what point of view are we, you know, are we looking at things from? But nobody ever like looks at religious violence from this period and is like, those people were bad. This was oppressive and bad. But I noticed that there were statements throughout this book that were things like, oh, you know, if you thought the cover was bad, the contents are worse.
Right.
And I was very fascinated by that, not because I disagree on an emotional level, right? But because it represents kind of a different turn in academic discourse. Normally, at least in my experience in books like this, the value judgments get held and you try to hold back and just like have this kind of, even though everybody's always biased and everybody always has the direction they're going, there's a certain pretense that you're just merely examining something under the light. And that didn't happen in this book. And that's not bad. It's not good. It just is. But I think it's very interesting that we were willing to have some value judgments in here, but not go as far as you want it to go.
It makes this book easy to dismiss if you don't agree with it. So it makes this like okay, someone's reading who doesn't have the perspective, they're reading the book and saying, okay, they're calling oppressors bad, they're using value judgment language, this is their perspective, that's not mine, I don't have to think like them. And you kind of say, okay, that's what happens with value judgments. Okay, that's what you think, that's what I think, we're going to go on out about our day. It's not how you get change. That's what if that's a goal. The goal is to get change and to convince minds, persuade people. That ultimate goal, that's how you get change, is persuasion. So I don't agree with like the former way of doing it, of like, let's just present a whole bunch of academic theory either. I think there's a middle way of like, okay, let me present different facts. I'm still going to talk out of the facts, but I need to present different facts, right? And present facts differently, and, you know, get into how the other person sees things, see what their facts are, see what facts they're seeing, and then try to deconstruct some of that stuff that way, or help them see what they're not seeing, which would help them make some links. So I spoke about the hero part, the story. I think that was something that could have been emphasized a little bit more. The other part, and this is a huge part, and I find that it was in there in spots, but like not where it needed to be, which is front and center. What is colonialism? Colonialism at the end of the day is policies and law. So when a colonialist goes to a place, they don't just like win a bunch of wars and then that's it. They set up the laws. They restructure society. They institute power structures, and they institute ways of enforcing those power structures. So I'm going to make a whole video about this because I think this is a really important point that very few people understand, because from a place of privilege, it's hard to see. Violence is violence. Violence is not oppression. Violence is the individual acts, and gamers can kind of do whatever they want with it in their heads. It's fun to be violent in games. Okay, fine, violence. Oppression is a whole nother level of colonization and colonialism. What is oppression? Oppression is the constant pushing down of peoples through enforcement mechanisms, through law, through cultural norms. It happens on the every single day. It is a difference between a romp, kill all the orcs, and a game like Papers, Please, where it's like, I'm doing the violence, but I'm doing it by just demanding someone have their papers. And if they don't have their papers, then they're out, they're excluded.
Right.
And this, in a way, colonialism is about following the rules. And that parallel should be with games all the time. What happened? Why are you getting excluded? Because you don't follow the rules. Colonialism is another group gets to make new rules.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what makes expressing thoughts about colonialism through games extra interesting, because in order to play a game, you are implicitly agreeing to follow the rules of the game. And so if the game is structured, like, once you decide you're going to play colonialism, you agree you're going to play by colonial rules.
Yes.
And that's, emotionally, historically true. But it also makes you wonder, like, okay, what are we doing in our games that we are asking players to implicitly accept as the norms? Because that's where it's hiding.
The workers can't win in a game. It's against the rules. Guess what? The workers can't win in colonialism. It's against the rules. And so in a game, there's no pushback. There's no agency. We talked about, or like many popular kind of, and I focus a lot about workers. You can kind of do it other places. I'll focus on workers. So in the game, it's literally against the rules for the workers to win, because the workers aren't even people. Right? They're just like little like resources, right? So it's against the rules. In a colonialist perspective, the workers are the same. So, if you're an indigenous population, you're a worker. You're there to generate value. And if you try to be other than that, well, that's breaking the rules. And this is not a game that gets enforced. And that's how you bring people back within the bounds of the game.
Right. I also think that these sorts of conversations are especially topical now. And like, I'm just going to go here because it's my podcast. I can do what I want. I'm a teacher. I'm one state north of Florida right now. If you think that it's ridiculous and just silly to be banning books and making it a class 3 felony for a teacher to lend a book to a student that a parent disapproves of, to try to limit what books kids can bring to school themselves because maybe they'll expose someone else to something else, these are setting the rules that lead to future problems.
Right.
Even if you think the rules are stupid and say, well, I'm just going to break them, it's actually not that easy. This is now putting people's jobs on the line and resetting the rules in a way that's going to limit what people are allowed to say and think for who knows how long, for as long as it persists with unknown consequences. And so, all of these little it's just a silly legal thing. You can twist around it. You can get out of it. No, you can't. Not after a while.
Or the fact that you're twisting around in the first place, you've already distorted what you're teaching.
Yes.
So if I'm, and the big thing in Florida is, not the modern Black perspective of Black Lives Matter and CRT and all kind of stuff. So I can teach these other things and kind of get excuses that they're not CRT, and I can sneak it, quote unquote, sneak it in that way. Well, by the sneaking, I've changed the it.
Yeah. And
now I'm teaching a different it. And so therefore, because of the rules of whatever is happening, I have to do a different thing. Yeah. So zooming back on the lens, how do games recreate culture? Well, games, they teach us how to follow rules. I've done this as many times. Games are good for teaching kids how to take turns, how to, wait their turn, how to be a good loser. And so there's so many things.
How to milk rules to get what you want.
And what's possible, telling people, what, how to push, against the boundaries of the rules and that kind of stuff. So when a game, so there's not just I am a 16th century colonized, I'm learning about colonization, these heroes, that's one part of it, but just the idea of what's possible. I get into so many conversations about worker-centered board games, and people are like, oh, that's boring, that'll never happen. Well, I thought that games were a field where you do whatever you want.
Right. Also, most of us are workers. Are you saying that we're all boring?
Or that it's not possible for us to kind of overthrow our bosses or live joyously. And did all game teach that? No. Did the preponderance of games that center the powerful people and the rich and all that kind of stuff, did that teach us that? Then I'm willing to say yes. That didn't come from nowhere. I put it on the it's just a game person to tell me where that came from, because I think it came from games, media, movie, and all kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So this inability to imagine that we can have games that are other than comes directly from the ways in which we are taught to follow the rules of certain games. Yes. Just as in a colonial perspective. So I can say in a way that the colonial mindset, really what it comes down to is follow the rules, and they're absentee rules. They're somebody else's rules, and they will be enforced violently if you don't follow the rules. So I've never really read that. That's kind of a thing that I'm developing, and it prompted. It was actually prompted from this book, so I got to give the book credit for prompting, thinking on my part. Oh, this definition isn't what I would do. What would I do? That kind of came up with this. So I'm not saying I'll think like I think. I guess what I'm saying is, if you want to influence people, if you want to really cut in, get change in the hobby, we need to think a little bit more broadly than just saying colonizers are bad. Don't do that.
Yeah. And I think, as you were talking, I was just kind of trying to narrow this down for myself into something pithy. you know how I am. But it just made me think, if you can't get out of your own perspective, it's not because your perspective is obviously right.
Right.
It's because you might be stuck in it. If you truly can't see what somebody else is seeing, that is a sign of intellectual stagnation, not intellectual, you're locked in because you're right.
Yeah, and they say that, like they actually say, we are two European or American European white academics, and we have our perspective, and we're gonna have blind spots. So like, it's not like these aren't attacks. These aren't like,
No.
oh, this is terrible. Like they own the fact that they just have a perspective, and
Yeah.
I'm imagining by admitting that they're open to thinking differently. So this is kind of an invitation to be like, okay, here's a way to think differently about it, which might get us as closer to the goal, all of us
Yeah.
closer to the
Well,
goal, which is to get change in the hobby.
as a post-doc person, right? Like I understand all contributions to academic literature as you never think you have the final word. I guarantee you nobody ever, unless they're just
Right.
nuts, thinks that when they publish an academic book. The point of an academic book is to contribute to an ongoing conversation over centuries. And so this is a great contribution to that conversation, because look at how much we've been able to talk
Yeah.
about it. That book
Absolutely.
gave us some intellectual anchoring spaces and made some statements for us to kind of bounce off of, think about, push ourselves with.
Mhm.
That is the essence of a good academic book. And that's why, even though I don't agree with everything in here or think that, of course, it's not what I would have done, but like, of course not. But the fact that it managed to push us with this much gas, right, tells me that is a book that's worth being part of the conversation, that's worth engaging with, and that did its job.
I think you said it great, where it's like that. I think the best audience for this is the academic who isn't a gamer, but who isn't a gamer who wants to kind of apply these tools to games. I think that's like really well said. This isn't the audience that is listening to this podcast necessarily because they're game centric. Will that audience get something out of this? Yeah, I mean, I think that you'll get the history, the survey of games, which is really fun in and of itself. You'll get nice pictures. You'll get as Liz said, some foothold into the conversation. So even though I found the conversation kind of limited itself in the way it defined colonialism, it still represents where we are, where a lot of us are, and gives us a launching point for more. So yeah, we could definitely recommend the book on those levels.
Yeah. I mean, this book, I think, represents an important moment in game discourse, because it is nice to see academics writing a book that is an academic book, but also engages our community.
Mm-hmm. Actually,
And it's Mary Flanagan's community too. She's a gamer and an academic.
And
And
she makes
so,
games. She we don't know it because her games aren't in like Target and get that million copy print runs. But yeah, no, they she's part of a outfit. I forget exactly what it's called, but they make plenty of games, like social games and educational games. One thing we should mention is that last chapter, you had glanced at it because you mentioned Spirit Island and a couple other games, but they do talk about a whole bunch of games, and they mentioned the Zenobia Awards, and they
yes.
mention Stonewall Uprising, and they mention kind of a lot of the other games that are kind of bubbling up. Did you feel how did you react to that last chapter, kind of going through where games could go?
I just wanted more, but I think that that's the nature of, like, they put their investment in making sure that the grounding was there, and so now it's up to their next book or somebody's next book to kind of pick up the ball and keep running. But it also made me happy to see, I guess, the acknowledgement of all the work that we, like the gaming community, right, are doing. And it, I'm really excited by Stonewall Uprising. I'm really excited about a lot of the games that are coming out. I think that we're entering a really good age for historical games trying to push in different directions, and that they are aware of it too, and that they're hitting the right pulse point, that this is where we're going to move forward. If you want change, this is where it will be.
And yeah, I mean, it goes back to kind of my influence point. Like, okay, these are very small games, so it's like you got to be really careful when saying, okay, this is the possible future of the hobby, because I mean, the possible future of the hobby is like Kickstarters and $1 million things and everything. And I wish kind of being a little bit more honest about the fact that, okay, it painted a sunny picture of what's on the horizon, but I think it could have done more to be like, okay, this is actually what's happening in terms of like the influential games. We're still getting chainmail bikinis on Kickstarter. We're still getting, the Archaeos Society, which this book was finished in 2021. 2023, we got the retheme of Ethnos. Ethnos is a game that kind of has some, it has its fans from a couple of years ago. It's getting a reprint with a Indiana Jones researcher theme going around the world, scanning artifacts type thing. There's a giant monkey statue on the face, and it's like, oh my God, here we go again. So we're still getting that, and I think the book could have been a little bit more like, okay, no, this is the hopeful part. This is where we are, and the reason I say that is I want to help like the next generations understand that we got to put our bootstraps on. Like
Yeah.
you have to be in this for the long haul. It isn't just a question of, oh, let's, make other games, and gaming will kind of like flower that way. That's a part of it, but we're still in the poo when it comes to cultural appropriations and stereotyping, all that kind of stuff. And we've got to strap in. So it was a little bit of, again, going off of the idea, how can this book help?
Yeah.
Some ideas of like, okay, this is how the book could have helped, and this is how maybe future works built on this could help.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely see your point. I think what's happening there too, though, is that, I, as a post-act person who likes to talk about historical games, like I'm really drawn to those more niche games because I love talking about them because they give me something to grip onto when I'm talking.
Right.
If that makes sense. They're actually saying something. They give me a statement to interact with. I think
you're with the Zenobia Awards, so you're right in there.
But the area where you're working is harder because it's easier to dismiss what you're saying about what you see. It's less concrete, and you can just be like, oh, it's just a theme. It's right. You work in the territory where, Taylor Schuss is making a statement about, queer history. It's right. You can interact with it because he said something. It's harder to interact with something that is saying something but pretends that it's not. And that's where the real insidious things happen. And it's also where it's much harder to get a grip. It's much more like protean. And it's much easier for somebody to rhetorically slide away from you when you're trying to make a point about it.
In a way, yeah. I'm so glad you said that. In a way, I guess I'm saying, please help me. Can someone help me, please? I get a lot of comments, and this is a me thing. I know, but I think we're reacting kind of from our own perspectives. Like I get so many comments of people who are helpful and they're on the right tip, but they'll DM me. It's like, okay, I don't want to do what you do. Like I don't want to kind of go into the maw of the beast and deal with these, different these, kind of moderate perspectives, and I can't do what you do. And I'm thinking like, I can't do it either. I mean, I'm doing it, but it's exhausting. I had to take a 3-month break because I got so burned out. And I think the idea that like, because I have a philosophy of how to get change. And I think there's a lot of people on our side that want to get change. It is hard.
Yes, especially because
it isn't just like, let me kind of educate people in my liberal perspective and people will hold on to. It's so easy for them to dismiss it if it stays at that level. You can't let people off the hook like that if you really want to get change.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll readily admit, like, I'm a relatively culturally comfortable white lady. Like, it's easy for me to not to say, oh, I'm not going to let that get to me. That's not a huge deal. But in aggregate, it is. And, I have to do the work of kind of stepping back and be like, oh, wait. Like, party foul.
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's a project that we're all engaged in. Like we said earlier, right? Every single person who plays games and designs games and talks about games, we're all contributing to gaming culture, and we get to make our choices about the contribution that we want to make. Every single person, from the person who's like just really mad on Facebook, to the person who sends a nasty screed email, to the person who makes a fake account on Twitter, and also the people who are out here, trying to make critical content about games and who are trying to design thoughtful games. Every single one of us, wherever we are, is contributing to this culture. And so we all get to decide what kind of culture we want to have and who we want to be in this world of ours.
All right, I'm good. I think again, but no, seriously. Stepping back, I recommend this book for all the reasons that we said. It at the end of the day, it does continue a conversation. It does, yeah. And I mean, if at the end, if you can come up with your criticisms, okay, and we do, but if a book contributes to a conversation, and so going back to like, okay, what would Dan Thoreau think? What would Cole Worley think? They'd be like, it continues a conversation. Boom, done. Go ahead and read.
Yeah, I would guess that as well. I mean, you talked to Cole about this, so I'm assuming that you. But yeah, I do recommend that you read it if you're interested in these topics. It's a nice grounding. And then I recommend that you keep going, because reading one book is never enough. You got to read more. Start here, keep going. Anything else to say before we sign off? Where can be found online and all that?
Season 6. We're looking forward to season 7 at some point. 8, 9, and 10.
Hopefully.
Not going anywhere.
Absolutely not. And then you are still on the One Stop Co-op Shop. And are you updating Stealth Toys right now?
I think when it came, so people know at this point, Puerto Rico 1897 is released. I won't say a lot about it because there's a whole other conversation in terms of printing errors and production issues that I just don't have anything to do with. So I just don't feel it's my place to kind of participate in that conversation. In terms of the thematic statement that it made, I think people are getting it. And my hope is that the product can kind of overcome some of those production issues, and we can get back to kind of talking about that Puerto Rico on that thematic level. So I kind of ended shelf stories. I'm like, okay, this is what I'm talking about, people. This is shelf stories. And if you don't think that's shelf stories, then go back and figure out what I am really about. I am not about games for a quote unquote tiny minority. I'm not about taking games away. That's the things we get accused of. No, I'm for games for everybody. And this is my thesis statement. And if you don't understand that, then, well, we need to talk about what is happening and not just what you think is happening, right? So that's where I kind of ended my active run of shelf stories. And if other stuff comes up, then I'll throw up the flag and kind of run it back. I'm also, I think I mentioned this before, we're still designing our People's History of the United States. It is now a card game, a pure card game. Who knows what it'll be? It might just be a mini fest in 6 months. But I visited Greg. We had a whole weekend design jam. We got a lot done. So it's happening. So we're feeling good about it.
Beautiful. And I'll put your Twitter handle in the show notes. And everybody out there, hopefully you know by now, I can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. So please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.
Hey, everybody.